Hi guys, welcome to IP&D Webcasts. My name's Rahul and I'm a Udacity coach. Today we'll be talking about Css Selectors Syntax and how we can apply Css selectors to HTML to stylize our HTML. So we noticed that the relationship between HTML and CSS can be confusing at times. After you've added the link attribute in your head element, how do the two relate? How do we actually get our CSS to be applied to our HTML? Well, in this webcast, we'll be going over how to do that. Think of a CSS selector as a rule that defines a set of style attributes. Because style is a huge part of making web pages look nice, and because it often requires many different attributes to make a web page look nice, we separate our selectors into a file we call the CSS file, which you've used since the beginning of your nano degree. Your CSS file consists of these rules that group things like font, color, text size, etc. Today we'll be talking about 3 ways we can organize these rules, also known as selectors. And the 3 types of selectors that we'll be talking about are element selectors, class selectors, and descendant selectors. Now, an element selection is the most basic form of CSS application. When we say element, just remember that we're talking about HTML elements here. So tags like paragraph tags, h1 tags, div tags, etc. Any stylings that we define in these selectors are automatically applied to all corresponding tags in our HTML. So if we define an element selector for the paragraph tag, like we did here, the stylings will be applied to all instances of paragraphs within our HTML. So let's look at an example. Let's add a paragraph tag into our HTML. So an element selector is just one that applies a styling to a predefined HTML tag, like paragraph, like we have here, like we just mentioned. Now, let's open up this file within our browser to see what happens. Okay, so here's our paragraph tag, and we see that it's blue, just like we designated in our CSS file. So our element selector is working. It's taking what we define in the CSS, applying it to the paragraph element in our HTML, and we see the result in our web browser once we open it up. Okay, an element selector is pretty simple. You can do the same for each one, and you could call it a font family as Arial or something similar. So let's move on to class selectors. A class selector is a user-generated name that can be applied to any relevant HTML tag using the class attribute. If you've encountered variables in programming before, you could think of a class selector as a variable name. Take a look at this example. I defined a class selector called myTag, and you know that it's a class selector because of this period at the beginning. Now, it's not useful to define any sort of selector in your CSS without having a corresponding HTML element. So let's just add that. Here, I've defined another paragraph tag, and you'll see that I added this class attribute to the tag. And within the class attribute, I give it the value myTag without the period. So if we save our file and go to our HTML, our web browser, we see here is a custom styling I made applied to a paragraph tag, all in red. So again, we have the application of our class selector to our HTML. Now, the great thing about a class selector is its flexibility. It can be applied to any HTML element so long as you apply the class attribute and the styling makes sense for the tag. For example, you wouldn't apply font styling to an image tag. So let's try applying the same style tag to, say, an unordered list. Here we have an unordered list, and I've applied the class myTag. So I'll save my doc. And if we go to our web page, we also see that red has been applied to the list element, even though it's a completely different kind of HTML element. So that's the beauty of class selectors. Let's talk about the last kind of selector that is really relevant in designing web pages, in adding styles to your HTML. So let me ask you, what if you're in a situation where you'd only like to apply a style to a nested element, that is, a tag within another tag, such as this situation. You can make an element selector that applies a set of styles, but that would affect the paragraph tag outside of the div tag as well, what we defined up here. More plausibly, you could use a class selector to style the inner tags of this div, but then you'd have to apply the class attribute to each paragraph tag within the div. And that's tedious if you have a ton of different tags. So that's where Descendant Selectors come in. Notice that all we're doing here is combining two different element selectors. We could also combine class selectors and mix and match. Here we're combining the div selector and the paragraph selector, which are both element selectors. Descendant selectors are called such because the first selector, in this case div, is considered an ancestor to the second selector, which is the paragraph selector. And the paragraph selector is considered the descendant. The style that we have here, green, is only applied to the descendant selector, the paragraph, but only if such paragraph tags within our HTML are nested within a div. This way, we apply the style to all the paragraph tags within div and not affect the paragraph tag outside of the div, nor do we affect the paragraph tag within the div with the myTag class selector, rather class attribute. Now, let's just save this and verify. Awesome. So, notice that I've added this extra paragraph tag with the class attribute myTag. And I asked, what will happen here? Will it be painted green? Like we tell paragraph tags within div tags to become? Or will it just apply the most specific selector that we designate, which is the color red? And our question is answered pretty swiftly, that the most specific selector is applied. So here, we haven't specified a styling for this particular descendant selector. So let's do that. If we add the following descendant selector, we'll notice a change. Here, we have an ancestor selector of div, which is an element selector, and the class selector that we defined before, myTag. And overall, we've colored this thing yellow. So what will happen here? We turned yellow. In the descendant tag, we've applied yellow to the paragraph tag within the div tag. And we see that the descendant tag is applied only to the paragraph tag within the div with the class selector myTag. You can mix and match class selectors and element selectors when you create a descendant tag. Just remember that in the actual HTML structure, the tags must be nested within each other, and that you should expect the tag having the second selector applied to it receiving the styles that you defined. So, just to recap, element selectors are CSS selectors that essentially apply a set of styles to predefined HTML elements. Class selectors are CSS selectors that apply a custom class to any sort of HTML tag that you specify, and it can be used multiple times. That's why class selectors are probably the most often special kind of CSS selectors that you'll encounter. You'll also see descendant selectors, which are generally only used for nested elements and styling specifically nested elements, like we have here. Okay, well, that's all that I have for you guys today. I hope this was helpful in understanding how CSS selectors can be applied to HTML. And if you have any questions, don't be afraid to post onto the forum. Thanks, guys.